Last week we took a look at science itself. Science is not the problem, right? We were talking about the philosophy that says, well, wait a minute, we don't really want to believe in the supernatural. We'll throw that out and we'll say, let's just discuss things that fit in this box, right? The universe. And that'd be, matter, space, time, energy. So there you go. Everything has to come out of this box. We're not going to consider this at all. So today we're going to be looking at evolution. Guess what happens with evolution? It's the same thing again, right? This box disappears, and now you're left with this box. So if we're here today as a human race, then we all had to come out of this box somehow, right? You start off with hydrogen and helium and stuff like that, and ta-da, here we are today. So how do we get here? Evolution. It has to be that way. And I think a good place to start is just looking at two ways to interpret this verse in the Bible. Christians would say in the beginning God, right? That's from Genesis. So we would say, out of God sprang the universe. Right? So we're going to start with a two-box setup and say it came out of what God did. The evolutionist or the atheist, whatever you want to say, is going to say, no, in the beginning there were particles, or in the beginning there were laws of nature, or in the beginning there were whatever, right? But it was in this box, and that's how everything sprang out of this box. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's what we're going to be talking about today, those two different views. Think about how that changes your life if you answer the first way, that it's God that's the starting point. I mean, we just spend time in prayer. Do you pray if you say there are particles and that's it? Right? If this is the only box, why would you pray? There's no other box out there, right? There's no God. So why pray? If there's no God, what's the point? Why are you here? Well, you're an accident, right? You're a fluke of the universe. How should you live your life? Where's the answer to that? Just whatever laws get passed, right? What, Jerry? Yeah. Where do you go when you die? In the ground, right? You're just here. You just kind of get recirculated, and that's it, right? So what a different set of beliefs, and what a different way to live your life comes out of in the beginning God as opposed to in the beginning the particles. And yet that's what kids are being told today. This is the correct answer, right? In the beginning particles. So we're going to take a look today at evolution in Christianity, and especially the two different views that will take us from one to the other, right? So we're going to start at the bottom of this view here, at the beginning the particles. What are the reasons? What are people saying about evolution, and where are the holes in evolution? So we're going to look at that the first half, and then we're going to come back to the second one, which is in the beginning God. And unfortunately, it's not quite as neat and tidy as that. Christians vary, right? There are different perspectives that Christians take. Good, sincere, Bible-believing Christians can come to very different answers of how they work in Genesis. And so I don't know if you've grown up like I did. I thought there was just one answer. The only thing I heard was what's called young earth creationism. That's what I grew up on. Maybe you did too. So I just want to show you that there are some different views that Christians have within the area of evolution versus creation. So we'll get to that the second half of today. How are we doing? You have any questions, by the way? Feel free to throw anything out here.
Where did the particles come from?
The Big Bang, right? The singularity. Yeah, they can't go beyond that, right? They don't have any idea. Just something came out of nothing, and you got to believe that. Wait a minute.
So they're considered laws as what make up particles or whatever as something that's happenstance.
Well, have you heard of Stephen Hawking? Right? As Homer Simpson called him, that wheelchair guy. So Hawking put out a book about 4 years ago. It's called The Grand Design. And he said, let's see, how do we get a universe started? He said it comes from the laws of gravity. I don't know about you, but the laws of gravity have to work on something you got to have something there so gravity works. So I don't know how, if gravity just is out there, how does it bring a material universe into existence? So I don't know. I mean, they're really trying hard. They've got problems with it. We're going to actually cover that in 2 weeks, right? Not next week, but in 2 weeks. Well, we're going to cover some scientific discoveries that have been going on, recent discoveries. Are we what, an illusion?
Illusion. That's the one I heard recently.
We're an illusion. Wow. So we would never know, right?
Well, Hawkins didn't really mean that. He had a computer glitch.
Yeah.
Somebody had a hand over a penny.
Well, you know, to me, it seems like it's harder to just to believe or imagine we just came to being as intricately as we are made, but I can see it's hard then to understand too how God became and how that all happened too. So it's that we just take on faith.
Yeah.
Right, but it's just harder for me to imagine that we all just came together somehow and work as beautifully as we do without a divine creator.
So that's a really good point, because the evolutionist, right, the person down here is poo-pooing the Christian, saying, you guys are so backwards, you're just so superstitious, and you just have this great faith. But what takes more faith? To think that God created everything, or order came out of chaos, nothing produced something, consciousness came from unconsciousness, life came from non-life. You have to believe all those things, right, if you're going to be down here on this side of things. That takes way more faith, I think. There's a book out. I always push it because it's a great book. It's called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Right? So it's a good one, huh? So let's get started. We'll take a look at evolution first for the first half, and then we'll get to the different views of creation. And a good place to start is the fact that evolution is a pretty murky title, right, or a murky term to use. And remember we were talking a while back when I was here, we were talking about apologetics and tactics. And one of the tactics to do is when somebody says something, to make them clarify what they're talking about. What do you mean by that? Before you say, well, why do you say that? But the first thing is, what do you mean by that? So when somebody says evolution, that term is murky. And so we're going to talk about three definitions. Two of them, Christians don't have any problem with. It's the third one that causes the problem. So here's the first one. Change over time. Okay, I hope your car looks more like the one on the left than the one on the right. But that's just change over time, right? Things change. Manual Faith used to be on, was it 6th? 7th. It used to be on 7th Avenue in Escondido, and it moved out here. Our cars look a lot different than they did when they're newer and all. So change over time. We don't have a problem with that. Everybody understands that. If you talk about the evolution of the what's the new Corvette, right? The new Corvette. So it's in its, I think, 7th rendition or 8th. Anybody car fan here? I think it's the 7th one. So that's evolved, right, over time. Oh yeah, okay. So we're not going to end up in a big battle over that one. What about a second definition? This is called micro. What does micro mean when you put it on the front of a word? Small, right? Small. So there is small evolution, sure. Look at the breeds of dogs, right? That's evolution within a species. Cats, right? There's tons of different kinds of cats, tons of different kinds of dogs that are out there. And what happens? Well, over time, if you just let the dogs go out in the wild, they're going to revert to dog, right? Just dog. You're not going to get the little ones. You're not going to get the huge ones. You're not going to get the extra furry. I mean, you're just going to get kind of a generic dog. But if you spend time and you get into the breeding into things, look at what you can end up with, right? Very different looking dogs with different purposes and things like that. Again, Christians are not complaining. We're not upset about that. We get it. We understand that, right? That's not the complaint. Here's the problem. Here's the one that ends up where the battle takes place. It's called macro, meaning large scale evolution. So have you ever seen something like this? They call it the tree of life over on the left side, meaning that at one time you had this little dumb single cell animal and it started branching off. Over here you get trees, in the middle you get insects, and over here, ta-da, right? This is called the molecules to man theory. Started off with non-life. It started off, things just came together. Luckily, we get a single-cell animal. It gets more and more complicated. Dinosaurs are on kind of a dead end, right? So they got stuck over here. And here we are today. Notice we're not descended from apes. There's a common ancestor someplace back, is what they say. So we're not coming out of the apes. It's the apes split off, and then we headed off another direction. So that's called the tree of life. The reason I put this one up here, I know you can't read it because it's too small, but I just found that really interesting. To me, this illustrates one of the problems with evolution. This came out of a textbook about 1900, okay, so it's an older textbook. But what it is, it's a tree of life, but not for all animals, it's just for the human race. And so just like over here, you start with the more simple and you move to the more complex. We get, obviously, whatever is considered more simple, less sophisticated humans, and moving up to the more advanced. Guess who's on the bottom rung here, coming off of here? Negroes. That's what it says, Negroes. And they branch into different kinds of blacks, right? But they're on the bottom. Any guesses who's up here? Whites. Okay, so can you see already? There's the idea that you don't just sort people. You put them from top to bottom. You don't separate them this way. You go like that, right? And so if you're on the bottom, you apparently don't matter quite as much. And in fact, it'd be kind of nice if you kind of got them out of the system so the tree could grow better, right? You kind of want to prune. Right? You want to get rid of some of this stuff. That's how Planned Parenthood got started.
Because some white guy drew that.
Yeah, exactly. Margaret Sanger, the head of Planned Parenthood, I mean, she admitted it. They've got her documents of her talking about riff-raff kind of races. We got to get them kind of clean out the gene pool here a little bit. And so, what's that?
Oh, yeah.
Sounds very Nazi.
Yeah, she was a forerunner of the whole Nazi movement. Yeah. And by the way, the Planned Parenthood doesn't make a big deal about Margaret Sanger. They don't put much of her on their website. She is the founding
But they still
person.
give the Margaret Sanger Award.
They give an award, yeah. They just don't want to talk about what
And they
she
wanted to
really
get rid
said.
of poor, criminals, anybody with any type of disability. I mean, poor people. She wanted them, because poor breeds poor.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, that's why a lot of the centers were originally, the Planned Parenthood centers were put in major cities, right, where the minorities were located, so you could kind of help them, in that way. But so there we go, right? That to me is one of it, kind of foreshadowing some of the things that evolution got itself into.
Gary?
Yeah.
And so when I look at something like this, my question is, so why did we stop? If it's an evolutionary process.
Oh, we're going. We just don't see it because it's so slow. But give us another billion years, right, and something will change.
It will be something different.
Yeah. It's ongoing. Science fiction is really good at that. I love to read science fiction, but it's always talking about the next level. We're moving on to something bigger than this. Okay, so be careful, right? When we talk about these three levels or three definitions of evolution, just be careful because I call it the old switcheroo. When somebody maybe will try to convince you that macroevolution is true, they'll say, hey, yeah, it's obvious because, and then they'll give you these examples. These have all ended up in textbooks as examples. They'll say, well, yeah, macroevolution is true. For example, on the Galapagos Islands, there are these little finches, and some of them had a little longer beaks, some of them had a little shorter beaks. And when there was dry times, it was harder for the bird to get in there and get seeds it needed. And so the longer beaked finches survived. The shorter beaked ones tended to die off. But when the weather got better, then the shorter beaks were fine because there was food all over the place. And they'll say, see, the beaks, the length changed. Now, is that macro? You still had finches, right? They were finches, and they were finches, and they were finches. They didn't change into something else. That's microevolution being given to you as an example of macro. And you go, no, I don't think so. How about bacteria that ends up being drug resistant? It's still what? Bacteria, right? It didn't turn into anything else. Yeah, it gained some advantage. That's true. But it didn't turn it into anything different. In England, they had these things called peppered moths. They were light-colored moths, dark-colored moths. And the story was that when the Industrial Revolution came and soot ended up being poured out of these factories and you had more trees getting darker and darker, that the light moths stood out and got picked off by birds. And so you started losing more of those moths and you had a predominant dark moth. Is that macroevolution? No, it just got moths at the beginning, you had moths at the end. Right? So this is not, I'm not making this stuff up. This has been put in textbooks. Our son was in a class years back, in a biology class. The teacher dragged out these things and had them as, ta-da, proof of evolution. No, I don't think so. So just be careful. Sometimes they don't give you an actual macro example, they'll give you a micro example. They'll play around with a few. We'll talk about some of those later. So here we go. Think of a table being supported by 4 legs. Evolution is going to depend, and this is what we're going to do for the heart of the discussion today. Evolution is going to depend really strongly on these 4 supporting pieces, 4 legs of this table, right? If you got evolution, you need good unbiased science, right? Science has to honestly and sincerely find evidence to support it. You need something called spontaneous generation. In other words, life from non-life, right? That's got to happen. And in fact, it's got to be fairly easy to get life from non-life. You got to just take a bunch of chemicals, shake them up, put them in a beaker, do something, and you get life, right? Otherwise, how'd we get here? Remember, you only have this box, right? So spontaneous generation has to happen somehow. Stuff has to pop into existence as life. Third thing you need is mutation, right? Little genetic changes. And when that genetic change happens in an animal, it helps the animal, right? So that animal gets to survive, and the others that don't have that die off, right? So that's called natural selection. And so that whatever that change was, then the animal is now in the next generation. It keeps that change. Its offspring have that change, and then it can have more changes, right? So that's supposedly how you get evolution. The last one are transitions. This is what I think, Carol, you're talking about. Huh? You know, if evolution is going on, then things got to be changing all the time, right? So if we go from a dinosaur to a bird, there must be a lot of things in between that were sort of part dinosaur, part bird. And they usually trot out this thing called Archaeopteryx, which is now being rejected as a transitional device. They have a few, right? They have some that they've trumpeted, which is kind of funny. If they make such a big deal about one or two, where are the millions that ought to be there? So we'll talk about that in a second. So does this make sense? These are the four pillars that are going to hold up evolution. So we're just going to go one at a time and show some of the problems that they're having in all four of these areas. And I bet you know the answer already for number one. This is what we covered last time. For many, not all, but for many of these scientists, they have a philosophy at work. Remember last week we did that Richard Lewontin? I did the longer quote. I just gave you part of it today. He says, this is all there is because we don't want to have a divine foot in the door. We don't want to allow a divine foot. So in other words, he's saying right off, I will not consider this. I'm not going to deal with this, right? That's gone. Here's what we got because we don't want to talk God. Okay. But is that science, or is that already a philosophy saying this is how we're going to work our science? I mean, do you see, for a lot of people, they're just immediately cutting out some aspects and saying this is what we're going to find no matter what. We're going to jam it in here, right? That theory is going to fit. I think you get a good hint here from Richard Dawkins. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Oh, there's a wonderful reason, huh? Oh, I'll buy it because of my philosophy. I thought you bought science because you said that seems right. You know, I've done my own experiments and I found it to be the case. No, not for Dawkins. This guy is a biologist, right? He's a scientist. He says, oh, thank goodness that came along because it gave me a chance to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So what came first? The atheism, right? So he's going to support a theory that backs up his atheism. By the way, if you've ever heard, here's another one of those odd stories that isn't true. Have you ever heard that when Darwin went out on his expedition that he was a Christian and he was just kind of shocked by all the evidence for evolution and all? You ever heard that? Okay, that's circulated out there. That's not true. He went out there already a pretty confirmed atheist. He came from a family of atheists. So there's no way that he was so overwhelmed with the evidence he just gave up his Christianity. No, it didn't happen that way. So he had a philosophy going into that search as well.
Didn't he give up his beliefs of atheism in the end?
No. You know, those deathbed stories circulate, but not from what I heard. His wife was a Christian, but he lost his daughter, and so part of it was the pain of losing somebody in the family. But he came from a family that was just hard-nosed atheists already. William Provine, third person down here, is a professor. Was a professor, passed away not too long ago back, I think, Cornell University. He said there's no ultimate foundation for ethics, right? So if you have Darwinism, what does that do in a philosophical sense? Doesn't that give you the freedom to live like you want? There's no God out there watching you. Hey, party time, right? Whatever you want to do. And it's justified all sorts of things. You saw that little tree of life that shows the Africans down here and the whites up here. Hey, if that's the case, then do what you want. Go in and colonialize them and take all the riches and enslave them. Do what you want. We got eugenics, right? We're back to Planned Parenthood again. Margaret Sanger. If you believe that tree of life, we got to make sure the tree grows. How do you get a tree to grow? You cut off the dead parts. And so some of these races are holding us back. Okay. You get survival of the fittest. That's not a real good thing, right? If you're not one of the fittest, that puts you in a hole. And social Darwinism, right? Climb over people, get where you want to go faster. So a lot of that is philosophy. It's not science. People are attaching themselves to it, saying it's true, but it's true because I want it to be true, not because the evidence is so powerful. So number one, there's one of the problems. It's not always good science. Now, I don't want to indict all science. I'm just saying in many cases, the louder ones, the ones that get on the TV shows, the ones that write the books, tend to be in this camp, right? Because that's kind of a popular thing, kind of shove aside Christianity and shove aside the idea of God. Number 2, spontaneous generation. Oh, really? Okay, so back in the 50s or 60s, I think it was the 50s, they thought, it probably isn't all that hard to get life going. And so this 2 guys, Miller and Urey, sat down as scientists and said, let's think of some way that we could, in the lab, get life started. So it was actually a pretty simple thing there. They heated up a flask that had what they thought was the composition of the early oceans on the Earth, right? So they just put enough stuff together and shook it up and said, yeah, we think that's pretty much what the early ocean was like. Heated it up, so then they end up making a gas out of it, sent it over this chamber, and then hit it with electrodes. And the idea was, I bet a long time ago there were clouds on the Earth, and then lightning hit those clouds, and because of that energy, it fused molecules together, right? And then they went whomp, and they landed someplace nice and warm and cozy and said, hey, I'm waking up, I'm life, right? And they're on their way for life. So they did that. They sparked it, and they condensed it, and they got some gunk down here. And they said, I wonder what this stuff is. And they looked at it, and it was amino acids. So what's the big deal about amino acids? They're the building blocks of life, right? If you get amino acids and you shove some of them together, you get proteins. And if you get proteins, they carry out the functions in your cells right now. You got proteins going like mad inside you, keeping you upright, right? So that's a good thing to have. So they said, great, that's it, we've solved it. And this ended up in all the textbooks for the next 30, 40 years until they realized they had the wrong oceans and those amino acids couldn't do anything. They were completely the wrong types of amino acids. Even the guys that did this experiment later on said, nah, it's a dead end. So where are we today with the idea of getting life from non-life? We're further from that than ever because they were discovering in the last 20 years or so all sorts of conditions that have to be just exactly right to get life here. It's not that easy. You don't just throw some chemicals and just hope they all turn out right. We can't have our sun any place except where it is, inside our galaxy. We can't have any other color of sun. It's got to be a certain color to get life to go. The sun produces this energy and it sends off particles. They have to be the right kinds of particles or it just bombards the Earth and we end up radiated and we're gone. You've heard this before, I'm sure, the axis of the Earth, right? It has to be tilted just right so you can get seasons. Some planets are down and they spin this way, and some are completely up and they spin this way, right? Ours has to be exactly right. These are just a few. They found hundreds. And so I won't bore you with slide after slide of hundreds of these things. These all have to be dialed in exactly right or no life happens. Here are just a few more. Even the density, how much stuff is in the universe, that has to be just the right amount of stuff. The expansion rate, how fast is the universe flying apart? Right? So it goes on and goes on. You can go find them on the website if you want to. I'll send you a link and you can take a look yourself. All of these things have to be so precisely dialed in. In fact, I think this is a wonderful comment here. This comes from a guy who's not a Christian. Okay, he's an Arizona State professor. He's a big deal when it comes to writing about science. He's kind of taken over from Carl Sagan after he died. This guy is probably the premier writer about science, to clarify it. So I was flipping through Air and Space magazine about 5 years ago, and they were reviewing a new book that he'd written called The Eerie Silence. And this is coming from a non-Christian organization, right? The Smithsonian puts out Air and Space. So I thought, okay, I'll see what they say about Paul Davies. And they had a quote in this article, and my eyes just popped out, my jaw dropped, and I said, I got to make a copy of that. And I've got about 10 copies all over my office. I don't lose it. This is what he said. We are probably the only intelligent beings in the universe, and I would not be very surprised if the solar system contains the only life in the universe. That's a little different, isn't it? They were so optimistic 50 years ago. Life was easy. Life could happen any place. And they've looked and they've looked and they've done all these experiments. And what are they finding? This guy is saying, I think we're it. In the whole universe. Not just, well, we're it inside the solar system. He says, the whole universe. Gary?
What is the program that Carl Sagan started? The
Cosmos?
No, the searching.
SETI.
SETI.
Yeah.
And that's still ongoing.
Yep, we're going to talk about that in 2 weeks. Yeah, the SETI program with big dishes, those radio telescopes that they're looking at there. What's that?
Your tax dollars at work.
Your tax dollars at work. Well, again, they had great optimism back 50 years ago. They said, if we just tune almost any place in the sky, we're going to pick up radio broadcasts, right? Because there are other beings out. It's so easy to get life started. So they've looked for 50 years. Where are they? This is how much they found, right? Nothing out there. So I just read that. I thought, wow, this is a guy who doesn't have an agenda from a Christian perspective. He's saying it's too difficult. It's just, life is so difficult to get going. How about number 3, mutations? Well, let's talk about how it has to work, and then I want to show you some examples where you're going to go, I don't think so. So mutation has to be little tiny changes, right? You can't, the whole animal doesn't change. It has to be one little part. That's the way mutations are, and they're random, right? Remember, there's no God, so this is it. It's just random stuff that happens, just genetic flukes that happen. And each change, right? Each change has got to make the animal a little bit better to be in its environment. Okay, so far so good as far as mutation goes. Well, let me show you something that they've discovered in the last 20 years or so. Now they got better microscopes and they can look and see what's going on inside cells. Right now inside of you are all sorts of molecular motors. And we're not using that term motor in a cheap way, right? They really are little motors. Does that look like a motor? Yeah. This is something that bacteria, not all, but some bacteria have as a means of propulsion. They have like little whips that come out, and this would extend off a long distance. And this thing will spin inside the animal and create a propeller-like effect. And this thing can flip across whatever medium it wants to be in, right? If it's water or something like that. So this spins down here, right? There's your drive shaft. And it's got bushings to kind of protect it from the cell. This is the edge of the cell, the bacteria, the outer layer of the bacteria. And then this is outside into the environment, whatever it is, water or something. It's got this hook, or they call it universal joint, and attached to that is the propeller. Okay, so let me ask you, remember mutations happen one at a time, they're all random. So you're this little bacteria, you're cruising through your life and kind of hoping, gee, it would be nice if I could propel myself. And none of this is there yet, right? So mutation comes, and the next generation, for some reason, ends up with a bushing. Okay, so does that help the animal?
No.
You got a bushing, so what? That doesn't give you any advantage. Why would that allow you then to move into the next generation? I don't think so. What if a rotor comes along and is established? Does that help the animal? What if there's a change in this genetics and it creates a universal joint? It just sits there, right? The universal joint's got to hook in. All these things have to be here. The propeller has to be there. None of this does any good unless you get the whip part, right? The long whip piece. And guess what? They all have to be there at the same time, or there's no advantage. They all have to work, right? They're interlocking. Does that make sense? Be like a car engine, but you didn't have a piston? You didn't have a drive shaft or whatever? Same thing here. These would all have to evolve simultaneously. And this is just a simplified look at it. It's way more complicated. There are many, many pieces to this. They all have to be there at the same time. So wait a minute, how does evolution do that? And if that doesn't make sense, how about DNA? DNA is unbelievable, right? It's that double helix. If you can imagine a three-dimensional view, it's kind of like you took a ladder and you twisted it. Here are the rungs, but the rungs are made of 4 different chemical bases. They got fancy names, but they're just abbreviated A, T, C, and G. And you say, well, okay, so there's rungs on this DNA. Well, each of these colors is a clue to putting together amino acids. So what do we got here? We got a computer language. This is a language. There's another piece that comes along and reads this sequence. It reads it off, and then it says, oh, okay, based on that, I will build such and such. So for example, if you had a G and a G and a C, that would spell something out, just like CAT would spell out cat. But the C and the C and the 2 G's and the C will spell out an amino acid. So as the DNA is being read, and I'm going to show you a movie of this next time we get together in a couple of weeks so you can see it actually happening. But as it reads this, then it goes and it gets the amino acid that's in the system anyway and puts that here, and then it reads the next part of the DNA and it puts another piece of amino acid and puts something else. Pretty soon you fold it all up and you get a protein. That's computer code. Bill Gates said this is the most complex computer code ever. Does Bill Gates know computers? Yeah, I think so. Now, how do you get that to happen through mutation? How do you get one piece of this at a time? It all has to be there simultaneously, right, to create a language. Amazing. What about number 4? So here's the fourth leg or the fourth pillar. We're supposed to have a ton of transitions, right? That's what Darwin depended on. He said, not a lot of transitions now, but we just kind of started digging, as we dig more and more, we're going to come across many more of these kinds of things out there. But, I put 3 buts because there are problems with these. But the tree of life, remember we saw that tree of life? Not so much a tree anymore. They're saying it looks pretty much like grass. In other words, you have an animal, and you have another animal, and you have another animal. They can't figure out how they hook together, right? It doesn't seem to be a tree. It's just these animals popping up, especially during this one time called the Cambrian explosion. They have some simple-celled animals at one layer, and then a whole bunch of complex animals in the next layer, and they can't figure out how did those complex animals come about. Well,
The other problem with that is they date the rocks that they find the fossils in, and they can't date the fossils because they can't find, the different layers that are supposed to exist.
Yeah. I didn't even get into that, but right, you got some dating problems with the layers of rock as well. And what's weird is some animals haven't really changed very much. So if transitions go on all the time, why aren't we seeing that when it comes to bats and cockroaches and things like that? So major problems, yeah. Even evolutionists, right? So again, I love to quote people who are in the field, so it's not me and it's not Christians who have an agenda. I won't take the time, but one says there's a regular absence of transitional forms. It's not even in the mammals. It's a universal phenomenon, right? So it's like, we're okay over here, we just can't find them over here. No, they can't find them anywhere. How about this thing, right? Thanks to Jurassic Park, we've been told over and over again that dinosaurs turned into birds, right? That's what the velociraptors were. They were kind of sort of bird-like, right? They're pretty fast. They weren't the big plodding beasts. Well, here's a quote from somebody. There's no fossil of any of these stages, right? You have dinosaur fossils, you got bird fossils, nothing in between. How about this next person? He says, it's not the scarcity of material. There are real deficiencies, right? There are plenty of fossils out there. It's just where are these transitions? My favorite is the last one here. The best place to start the evolution of the vertebrates is in the imagination. Again, these are not Christians talking. In the field, they say it's the dirty secret of the evolutionists. And when they get together and talk about it, they're very frustrated. But when they turn their attention to the general public, when you see something in National Geographic or whatever, everybody nods, oh yes, evolution's doing very well, thank you. Transitions are a major problem. They're not there. Okay, so that's the quick view, the quick and dirty view of evolution. How about creation? I'm going to spend very little time because I've got a different talk that I can do and go into more detail about this, but you may have been surprised. There are actually at least 5. In fact, there are more, but these are the major positions on creation. So if we want, okay, what do we do if we don't buy into evolution? Well, we've got a rich choice ourselves when it comes to the creation perspective. Do any of these sound familiar? Not really? Okay. So there's theistic evolution, young earth, the old earth sometimes called day age, analogic, and framework. So let's just real quickly show you what each of them says, and I want to tell you that there are some problems and some successes within each of them, because I'm not here to push a view off on you. So what's theistic evolution say? Well, look at the name. Theistic is God. Evolution says evolution. So it says that we really did go from single-celled creatures to humans, like that tree of life, except God was, I put it in brackets because it's like God is hidden, but He's the one actually directing all these mutations and all these changes. Okay, so that's theistic evolution. Young earth people say, if you look at Genesis, it says day 1, it says day 2, day 3. Those are 24-hour days. So creation took place over a week, right? 6 days. And the earth, therefore, is really, really young. Maybe 10,000 years, something like that. The old earth people, look at the title, old earth, say the earth really is as old as the scientists say, but God had to intervene because you can't get natural selection mutation to get enough information in there. So He comes along and He creates, and then He lets things go for a while and then He creates. So it's 6 periods of creation, not 24-hour day periods. And then you have something called the analogic view that says, forget all the science, forget all those, the genealogies, trying to figure out the dates. All they were doing there was trying to tell you that 6 days of work is followed by 1 day of rest. That's how we should live our life. So it's just a 6-to-1 ratio. So that throws all the science battles out the window, right? Then you got something called the framework. Take a look sometime. This one intrigues me. I'm not sure I buy it, but it's a really interesting idea. It says, if you look at day 1, the light is created, right? God said, let there be light. Day 4 inhabits that kingdom with the sun, the moon, the stars, right? So they become part of that kingdom. So day 1, day 4. Day 1 is the kingdom. Day 4 are the things that belong in that kingdom. Look at day 2. It says the firmament and the sky. Look at day 5. It populates the sky because it creates birds on that day, and it populates fish on that day. Now, day 3 says, let's look at the land, right? God creates land. Day 6 are the creatures that inhabit that kingdom, including the human race. So it's land animals. So that's kind of weird, right? I mean, again, the science is not there. It's saying it's kind of a poetic picture of how God did this. Right? So day 1, day 4, day 2, 5, day 3, 6, if that makes sense. So that's called framework theory. I hadn't heard about it until about 5 years ago, and it seems to be catching on with some popularity. Is there support for these? Yeah. Are there problems with each one? Yeah, I think so. Theistic evolution, it's good because it ties in real closely with the modern view of science, right? You'd be very comfortable if you're a theistic evolutionist and you read National Geographic or Smithsonian, because you'd say, yep, that's the way it is. It just says God's in there somewhere. The problem is it doesn't really treat the early chapters of Genesis as literal, right? They don't think there's a literal Adam, as an example. So a lot of evangelical Christians are not real crazy about that view. The young earth view, it's very close to literal reading. If you were to take somebody who didn't know the Bible at all and you hand them the Bible and say, what does this sound like in Genesis? They'd say, it sounds like 6 days. Okay, so it's really close as far as a literal reading goes. The big problem, of course, is there's not much science to back it up. Right? Science seems to be coming down on this long period of time for the earth and for the universe. The old earth ties in real well with current science, but some people are a little uncomfortable to say, what? You're telling me a day is not a day? It's a period of time, kind of indeterminate, long period of time. So some people think it's making the Bible a little too elastic. The analogic one, nice. It doesn't even mess with the age at all, but they don't see the Genesis as literal again, so we're into that problem. Then the last one, framework, again, don't worry about the science, but it depends on turning the early chapters of Genesis into poetry, right? Not narrative. But it kind of sounds like narrative, doesn't it? Because it says Adam is saying this, and Eve comes along, and the serpent says this, and the framework theory says, no, we're just concerned with day 1 matching with day 4, day 2 with 5, and so on. How about this as a conclusion, then? We need to inform ourselves, right? We need to know this because the rest of society thinks this is a big deal, right? We're so science-saturated in this society, we better have some ideas ourselves about creation. How about charity to others who differ with us? Boy, some people get really hot about this. They kind of make this the stand. You know, if you don't agree with me, you're beyond the pale, you're a heretic or something. People get really angry. We should teach young people the problems with evolution, but we ought to also teach them the various views because, as an example, many of them here in Southern California are being taught the young earth view. It's real popular in Southern California. Down in San Diego is a place called the Institute for Creation Research. You heard about them? They have a creation museum in Santee. They're young earth. So these young earthers, if that's what they hear when they're young and they go off in high school or college, they're just going to get laughed out of the classroom because every science classroom thinks young earthers are just the knuckle draggers of this world. They're just really hostile to them, and they're just going to get a lot of flack for that. And then sharing knowledge with others. I gave you a pretty good list at the bottom of the page there if you want some more information, plenty of sources to look at, DVDs, some good books and all. I hope you do have a chance to catch up on it. So what's the conclusion? I think I'm on this side. Are you, as far as the choice? In the beginning, God, Genesis 1:1.